In mobile application security, good enough is a vulnerability. GuardSquare delivers the highest level of security for your mobile apps without compromise. Discover how GuardSquare provides industry-leading security for your Android and iOS apps at guardsquare.com.
Hello everybody, I'm Olympio Pope, InfoQ editor, and I have in front of me Victor Peterson, and he will try to bring more details about what happened in the SBOM part, especially with the legislative changes, and also what's actually really important for us to know as developers without having the big stick looking at us. Victor, you have a couple of things that you're working on, so please give us a short intro on what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. Quick intro. I've done a few startups. I got kind of thrown into the world of SBOMs in one of my companies when we started doing Secure by Design a few years ago. We had a mandate as part of that to start doing SBOM generation for our product. I thought that would be really like a tick book exercise done in a week and move on with it. Turns out it wasn't quite that straightforward. So I kind of got really deep into that. I ended up joining and co-chairing one of the working groups at CISA back in when CISA was active in the SBOM world. And we ended up creating a white paper on SBOM generation. That in turn turned out to be a lot more interesting than I expected. And I actually ended up creating a new company called SBOMify, where we implement that blueprint from the working group in basically letting you create high quality SBOMs, because it's actually a lot more challenging than most people realize. So that was kind of the goal there.
Thank you. It's very important because the supply chain attacks are getting more and more pervasive, especially nowadays. Yeah. But actually, it's not the easiest thing to push, because a lot of the people are just looking into, and they feel like it's yet another certification, or it's something that it's coming from outside. And actually, I think starting with this year, it's true, especially for the European Union. The Cyber Resilience Act, the CyRA, is coming to force. I think the US has some legislation in place. I know that UK spoke about it. So maybe let's start from looking at the sticks before going to the carrots.
So SBOMs have been around for a long time, right? They're not new by any means, but what we've started to see over the last few years, starting with Executive Order 4989, whatever it is, in the US, we basically already selling software to the US government, were required to start providing SBOMs. That was kind of the first stick, as you say, for software vendors to start generating SBOMs. The much bigger stick is, to your point, CRA in Europe. And the soft enforcement window starts this year. And I would say that most people are fully unaware that they are going to be impacted by this. And just for those who are not familiar with CRA, it's a piece of legislation that affects anybody selling products into the European market. And the litmus test they use in the legislation is obviously intentionally vague. And the idea is basically to make it anything that connects to the internet more or less needs to be compliant with CRA. CRA in turn requires you to generate SBOMs. So that's kind of why we're here today.
So that means that pretty much any electronic or software should have a SBOM, or well, actually the label showing the ingredients that are in. So that's scary.
Yeah, I mean, so many people are fully unaware of this, and it's kind of a GDPR moment, I would say, for Europe. But I guess people are less aware of this than they were about GDPR in many ways. But unlike GDPR, where the stick was large fines, the stick here is having your product blocked from the European market, which is a much, much bigger stick than just fines. As you can see in the case of Meta and these big boys, they just assume the cost of GDPR fines essentially as a cost of doing business in Europe. They learned from this, and now it's the blocking of the market, which is a much greater stick to hit with.
What I particularly liked about the way how the CyRA came to being was the fact that the community was quite involved. And it seemed that the EU learned and actually listened. And I don't want to be on that side of the fence of the regulators, but I have to be happy as the consumer of digital services and digital products, and also AI, about these 2 points. The AI Act, that's not in the focus of our discussion, but also the CRA, because actually you saw it. What I'm afraid currently is the way how it will come to be implemented. And that's especially from the way how the European Union is built. So now you have the legislation in place, and then it's up to each of the countries of the European Union to implement it and to give it shape. I think Germany is one of the countries that already has a form for that.
Yeah, Germany's BSI is the first kind of real implementation. I think they're in 2.2 now of their interpretation of that law has been kind of evolving. But just bringing back to your previous point, and I'm not a fan of heavy-handed legislation either, but I think it's important to acknowledge that security is a market failure. We've seen this for so long. Vendors do not care because it's not in their interest from a financial perspective to invest in security. And the consequence of that is baby cameras being exposed publicly on the internet and so forth. Right? So I think there's a good reason why this exists, because the market really failed to self-regulate, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to take that responsibility and people that are actually part of it to do it. But on the other side, what are the benefits for us as software developers, practitioners? Because it comes with added benefits as well. Let's look into those things. What would be useful from your perspective as a developer for other developers to know about SBOMs?
Yeah. If you purely treat this exercise as a tick box exercise, where it's just, I'm doing this for the sake of being compliant, then you're not really reaping out the benefits of generating this. And you're creating a lot of work for no reward, right? But the reality is, if you actually make this operational, and a lot of companies are already, this is not theoretical, a lot of companies are using this heavily as part of their workflow. They're using SBOMs to do security audits of their code base, and they're using it to do a license compliant audits of their supply chain, right? So a lot of companies have policies for, we're not allowed to use, say, GPLv3 code in our source code or in our libraries. So you can use an SBOM for license compliance audits. More commonly, it's used for security audits. If you can generate an SBOM from a log file, you can then in turn find CVEs that are affecting. And the ecosystem is a bit more mature because there's also something that called VEX that goes on top of this, where you can say, yes, I'm affected by the CVE, but this CVE impacts this particular function in this library, but we're not using that. So you can issue what's called the VEX statement and say, yeah, ignore the CVE because we're not impacted by it. So it's a bit more sophisticated than what you would have in, say, Dependabot in GitHub, where you're just saying, hey, here's a vulnerability in this library, upgrade. Because sometimes that's not necessarily the best path forward, right? So I think if you're using it operationally and you're actually using the insights from this, it becomes a very, very powerful tool. And you can diff different versions and you see exactly how libraries evolve with time and so forth, right? So there's a great amount of utility in this if you actually use it properly and you actually use it as an operational vehicle rather than just busy work to be compliant with regulation.
So we shouldn't treat it like SOC 2 or ISO certification, a chore that you have to pass through.
I mean, I think the analogy holds true there as well, because if you look at SOC 2 and ISO, all the controllers are underlying. The controllers can be very helpful, right, in order to ensure your compliance with the framework, because they're not made out of thin air. I'm not saying they are perfect, but they do help you improve your security. And if you use it to help improve your security posture, rather than just farm it off to some kind of team that has no real involvement, then yes, you have no utility. So I think there are a lot of analogies with compliance and SBOM generation in general.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not talking about the content because obviously there are good practices into that. I'm just about the way how actually companies or individuals in companies are looking at it and just waving, okay, that's something that we have to do and it's just an Excel to have to fill in. And it's very interesting, especially as there are points when you don't even know that you have a library. I'm just thinking about the log4shell. Well, that's ancient history already, but it was probably one of the biggest security holes, especially in the Java ecosystem, since the era of Apache Struts. And what was funny is that at that point of time, I was working in a company that had built everything on top of the JavaScript ecosystem. So it was Node.js and all the source, and everybody's just cocking around that, okay, we're not affected, then blah, blah, blah. 2 hours later, we got an email from GCP saying that, unfortunately, that service and that service and that service, and also that service that we are using currently for a couple of our customers are all affected by log4shell, and they have to put it offline because we didn't have anything to do. And where do you stop? Because that was always a question for me and also for the audience when discussing about SBOMs, because it's like an iceberg and everything is built on top of the other stuff and so on and so forth. And then if you go recursively, you have to stop somewhere in terms of your references. How should you approach that kind of problem?
It's a fantastic question. I think the first thing to flag there, it's that ecosystems have very different maturity levels. And even within a given ecosystem, you have very different quality of tooling, right? Because ultimately, most SBOMs are generated from log files. And log files vary in quality a great amount. But I think the first thing when you go on your SBOM journey that you realize is that you actually do have to capture things in a log file. So going down the example of JavaScript, for instance, if you want to actually do SBOMs for your JavaScript stack, you can't just like load things and include in a header. You need to have them in a log file and actually start with that. So you actually trace that. By virtue of doing that, you have an inventory. And that is like, regardless of the SBOM or not, that is a step in the right direction because now you know what's going into your software. So I think the first discipline of leveraging log files and having good log files is the first principle that is really, really important here. Now, we talk about transitive dependencies, and that is kind of a slippery slope, right? Because you could say, well, I want to know everything down to source code, right? But I think it's a very, very ambitious goal for most companies right now. I think if you can start by focusing on your application library dependencies as the first initial target, that's a really good starting point. Then capturing operating system dependencies is kind of easier in many ways. I would treat them as different problem spaces, and I would definitely treat them as different SBOMs. But capturing that is easier. Now, it gets really difficult in the case of Docker, for instance. What if you have a Docker file where you're copying things in and so forth? There it gets a bit more complicated. It's a solvable problem. But I think one of the most important things is when you're starting your SBOM journey is that you start doing a sanity check and an inventory check. And I've seen this firsthand when we started doing this in one of my companies. We're like, oh, wow, we forgot about this. That hasn't been touched for a while. Or you realize that, I'm just going to use the Python example. Requirements.txt has been kind of like the standard for a long time in the Python world, but it makes no guarantees that it captures all the dependencies, right? Because it will happily, if you do pip install -r requirements.txt, it will happily do the tree expansion and pull in dependencies so that your log file is not capturing that at all. And it also doesn't do hashes and so forth. You can, but it's not built in. So I guess what I'm saying is by going on that journey, you start to realize that there are more modern package managers out there that do a better job, that will capture the dependency tree much better. So in Python example, moving to something like UV will give you not only a performance boost, but it also gives you much higher quality log file that will actually capture transitive dependency much better. The same is true for the JavaScript world, right? You look at new package managers like Bun, for instance, which generates a lot better log files than just having a package of JSON, which may or may not be pinned properly, right? So I think that is one of the biggest wins that you get from day zero without even using the SBOMs. By just getting onto that journey, you end up having high quality software.
So just to frame the main idea is that log files are quite important, and there is a good moment on this journey to revisit what you're actually using in terms of tooling, build tools, and the infrastructure. You pointed Python, which pip was quite known for its inconsistency and especially typo squatting and other types of attacks, or the NPM ecosystem, which again had its challenges. But just listening to you is that I think we were both two engineers that try to over-engineer a problem that theoretically shouldn't be like that. Because actually, if you think about it, all these pieces that you're looking into are all digital products, and actually they should come with their own SBOMs. So our direct dependencies will be more than enough, given that theoretically speaking, in order to be compliant, each and every company should have their own SBOMs, and then that will go at a different level. So
I would start with like that attack surface almost, right? So like if you're looking at any application, it's the application stack that is exposed. So starting there makes sense from a security perspective to do an inventory check to start with, right? Because then obviously there could be operating system vulnerabilities as well. But your most common attack vector will be the application layer. So that's kind of where you want to start regardless. And it's probably less. Yeah, I would say the application system is usually more hardened anyways in the first place.
Okay, so look at the dependencies in the application layer and then look at the other ones, because around your presentation, I spoke a bit with Alex Zenla from Edera, and obviously he's at the hardcore level of the operating system. And I know that they have a lot of work into that part where they are just saying that rather than going always with the only tool that is out there in containers, maybe a micro virtual machine would be better, especially if you can have this kind of attacks and something sensible. So I think there is a new wave of tooling and a lot of people that are doing a lot of excellent work. So I think we should open our ears besides having the SBOM in place.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But the one thing I would say is that 99% of all the people that is going to be impacted by CRA, they are not the hardcore engineering companies that's going to look at like the latest hypervisor technology to speed up the runtime. They will be companies that they have some kind of SaaS product or they have some kind of product in the market. They're not necessarily engineering first companies. Engineering is a cost center to a lot of these companies, and they're just going to look for the quickest solution, right? So I think it's important to highlight that, yes, that's great, and there are great ways to solve that, but we still shouldn't forget about the easy button for the vast majority of the companies that will need to be compliant.
So first and foremost, it's a good place to start at the application level. Look at that, have the SBOM in place. Then there are two different things. One of them is we can use that operationally, so we can consume ourselves the SBOM in our continuous integration pipeline to ensure that whether there is a CV, there is a new problem out there, we know whether we are affected or not. As you mentioned, it might be the case that we are not actually using that particular part of the code. And it's about being compliant. So from the legal point of view, the compliance department will want to know what kind of libraries are we using in terms of generating that. And then it's about regulatory, and that will start coming in place probably starting with next year. Now it's still just a transition period, so probably that will happen moving forward. You had a couple of other interesting points. One of them is the SBOM is not something that you should generate on your PC, but it should be part of the process. In the living organism of your pipeline, care to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to the whole CISA working group that we spun up, like one of the hard requirements we had as part of our recommendation for generation is that you must do the generation in a CI/CD pipeline. And this ties very closely to the importance of signing SBOMs. How you sign them doesn't matter so much as the fact that you do it, so that you can trace it all the way back. But in particular, if you're looking in the embedded world, for far too long, firmware's been built on somebody's workstation, right? And then they just shipped off over some like unsecured mechanism. Tooling has got a lot better, looking both like Zephyr and Yocto. These tools can be built in the CI pipeline now, and they can generate SBOMs, and they can be signed in the pipeline. But it's important that it becomes part of your blueprint, right? That becomes part of the CI/CD fabric for all the projects across your company. So you have a unified way of doing this, and you also have a good paper trail. So like if you want to traverse backwards, you can go back and look at the SBOM from a given release historically and diff that, or do things operational with that data, right? So that, again, it becomes useful rather than just busy work. So I think why it's important to do in the CI is because of trust, right? Because then you have a reproducible way of doing it. At least you have proof of attestation of how it was executed, and you can work backwards and you can see that paper trail.
I'm smirking because I know at least a handful of people from FreeBSD that when you say that that's reproducible, they will have a lot of things to debate around it, especially with FreeBSD, which they are very eager on generating everything up to the last bit. So then the important part is signing and using, let's say, machine infrastructure. So something that you don't have humans touching it. So it's the reverse trend as with AI. In the AI space, you want human in the loop. Here, it's important to have safe infrastructure, safe machines that are ensuring that, first of all, it's generated in a constant manner. And as you said, up to a point, it's something that it's more or less, you have a paper trail and something that is auditable. And on the other side is you know exactly how it was, and you have the digital signature on it that ensures that was not tampered with.
And the reason why this is even more important in the world of SBOM is because that SBOM will most likely be sent off somewhere else to some kind of platform. So I mentioned in my talk a project that I'm involved with called Transparency Exchange API, which is kind of the discovery mechanism for downloading and discovering security artifacts. In the context of that, the signing becomes even more important, right? Because how do you prevent that to be tampered with in transit, right? So in the case of, in example, as we do with SBOMify, one of the core premises for us and core fundamental beliefs in us that you should never have to trust us as a distribution mechanism. You should always be able to work your way back to the CI/CD pipeline where it was signed so that we have not made any alterations to that document. So you can always traverse back. You never have to trust us or whatever T provider you're using. You don't have to trust them. You can all the way go back. And I think that's a really, really important philosophical concept in the SBOM supply chain.
Thinking back, there are 3 pillars of the supply chain security a couple of years back, the point when I was more focused on this topic, and those were the SBOMs, so the ingredients that are going in the cake and the ability of tracing all of them, as you mentioned. Then it was about the signatories, about a notary where you just have this information, and I suppose that's maybe TIM, but you have to correct me if I'm wrong. And then it was the ability of reproducing it, the reproducibility of the content that you have. But let's go first with the TEA.
So TEA is basically a standardized API that you can discover. So I'll give you an example. So if I pull a box like this from a store, right? And it has a barcode. With T, all that I need to know is that barcode or SKU, and combined with the company's domain, I can find security artifacts. So it's a standardized discovery mechanism that allows you to find the artifacts. So it's not a storage mechanism. It doesn't do attestation. It relies on attestation back from the source, right? One of the most common ways of doing SBOMs today is to use like the SigStore ecosystem, right? And that's very well integrated in GitHub already. So that's kind of what we recommend people do it. But there are other ways to do it. And the reason is in T, we provide the hashes and so forth, but the hashes are kind of useless if you can't work your way back to like the source, because that could be tampered with, right, in transit.
So this is actually a mechanism through which you have the ability of checking the information that's out there, right? Let's say you have like a yogurt or whatever food product, you have the ability of actually knowing what's inside, and that's the ability of checking it.
Well, it's more like, imagine if an electronics store, right, and you're picking up like a webcam or, well, maybe a surveillance camera is a better example because it's going to be network connected, right? But if you can find the barcode for that product, and if they have adopted T, you can work your way all the way down to the SBOM, right? And that's really a really powerful concept.
And in terms of adoption, how far along is it?
So T is part of ECMA, and we are aspiring to become an ISO standard. And we're going into standardization for ECMA at the middle of tail of this year. And it lives under OWASP and Cyclone DX, which in turn is connected to ECMA. And the idea is to become like a fully standardized process so that it will be gaining more adoption. There was an NISA paper published this week, and they kind of highlight T as one of those mechanisms as well. So I think we're gaining momentum. To my knowledge, there are only 2 implementations of T that are open source out there. So Rearm and SBOMify are the only 2 implementations of T right now, but there will probably be more to follow.
As you mentioned, T is coming as maybe a spin-off from the group that brought also Cyclone DX, so from OWASP.
Yes, but it's important to note that T is vendor neutral, right? So it's not biased towards Cyclone over SPDX, for instance. It's a distribution mechanism.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I also agree that we in technology, we are like football fans. And if we were born cheering for a football team, it's seldomly the case that will change it. And that's why I'm saying that there used to be 3 standards that were pushed up front for the SBOMs. Now SPDX and Cyclone DX are actually the ones that gain more momentum. And that's my hope, that T will be actually vendor neutral and adopted all over the place, regardless of the format that you use.
Yeah, it also goes beyond SBOMs, right? So it's important to stress that T is a security artifact discovery mechanism. So it's not just limited to SBOMs. It can be VEX files, it can be compliance documents. So it goes beyond just SBOMs as a delivery mechanism.
Okay, so going back to your surveillance camera that I just bought from the shop, scanning the barcode might bring, maybe some VEX files, some SBOM files, maybe some advisories.
Yeah, manuals or anything you want, really, right?
So it's actually everything that can affect my security by using this product.
Yeah. So you could discover, for instance, that, this device is using an end-of-life software or a very, very outdated software. You can maybe decide that, actually, I don't want to buy this camera because I don't want to use something that is using an EOL version of, insert blank framework or insert blank operating system.
The regulatory boards, when coming and checking, they might ask you about SBOMs, so ingredients that went a couple of releases back. How can you approach that in a threat-free manner?
The answer is, it depends. This is one of the things that people haven't realized until they start doing SBOMs. And I didn't realize this until we're doing SBOMs. And this is literally why SBOMify was born, because of the problems around that we discovered firsthand when doing SBOMs at scale. If you're an open source project, stashing your SBOMs on GitHub makes perfect sense. You just make it part of the release artifacts, and voila, now you have an easy way to look back and traverse back in the history. If you're selling a commercial product, it gets a lot more difficult. And this is where people, when they go on their SBOM journey, only start to realize, because even a relatively simple product will have not one SBOM. You're probably going to have 10, 20, 30 SBOMs, because there's the backend, there are containers, there's firmware, there are so many things that makes up a real product, right? And your SBOM needs to represent all of that. And this kind of where SBOMify kind of was born out of, was to do that release management, right? So how do you say, okay, this release of my software is composed of these components, and some of these components, or many of these components, might be reused in their next release, right? There's essentially the top level release, and you point to these components. And then that is an important thing that gives you an audit trail of what made up a given release. Because in the real world, when you're doing a software release like that, it's going to be rather challenging in a year or 2 years or 3 years from now to try to reverse engineer what particular constellation of software made up a given release. I mean, you could do it, but it's going to be very expensive. You have to probably go into Git and find the date, and then it's going to be very difficult, right? So that's a big part of this release lifecycle management is being able to tag a release that spans other releases, right? And that's kind of one of the big things that we built out in that product is basically being able to cut a release that spans multiple components. And that then allows you to say, if an auditor were to come and say, hey, what was the constellation of version 2.1.0? You can say, here's the SBOM for this particular version and all the components made up that.
But now it's about tooling as well. 1-2 years ago, I was looking into SIFT. I know that Trivy was out there. What are vendor neutral tools or tools that you can use and have them to your pipeline? Leaving aside the giants like GitHub and others, if I just plain old pipeline, what should I use?
So I have a biased answer, which is we have something called SBOMify Action, which is like a superset of tools where we pick the best tool in our opinion for any given job. But the logic for that you can extrapolate from. And our logic is the ecosystem-specific tools tend to generate better quality SBOMs than the generic tools. So if you say the CycloneDX tooling for Python will generate, generally speaking, a better SBOM than, say, Trivy, for instance, right? Because generic tools, they tend to not extrapolate on all the metadata that all the various languages can do, right? Because each ecosystem, I mean, we've actually seen quite a lot of innovation in the package management space in the last few years, right? We mentioned UV and Bun as a good example of that lately. And many of the generic tools haven't really picked up with that. So first, you probably want to pick one camp, SPDX or Cyclone. And once you pick that camp, the tooling becomes a little bit easier to decide on. Both have tools that can do things. I would say there are probably more Cyclone tools out there than there are SPDX tools out there, because the SPDX tools favoring more libraries, whereas Cyclone favors more end user toolings. So in the case of Yocto, they're using the SPDX libraries, right, to build their SBOMs directly in their pipeline, whereas Cyclone have a lot more generic tool. Generic tool says, here's my Python log file, build an SBOM from that. Decide which camp you live in. That's probably a good starting point, and then pick a tool within that ecosystem.
Okay, so first of all, we have to choose as developers or ecosystem herders the tool that we are choosing, and then stay close to the ecosystem that we are actually in. Rather than using one hammer for each nail, use the appropriate tool for each and every one of them.
That's right. I mean, it's very compelling at the surface to like look at the generic tools because they can do everything, but there's a compromise there. And if you actually want to operationalize this and actually use the data, the quality of the data matters, of course. Garbage in, garbage out. If you want to make a decision on this, you want to have that best quality SBOMs as possible. But then what you're really aiming for is to get high quality SBOM. So looping this back to the working group, what we set out to do was to achieve NTIA minimum element compliance. And that's kind of the gold standards for SBOMs. None of these tools, to my knowledge, will produce an SBOM that is NTIA minimum element compliant out of the box. So you need additional toolings for that. But that's kind of the quality barrier that a lot of compliance regulations are starting to nudge towards.
What else should we know to be safe out there?
It's a really good conversation to start with a team. Like I think going back to where we started, doing an audit of log files is a really, really valuable exercise. Looking at your pipelines, making sure that it's best practice. Because if you work on a lot of code base, you forget about this stuff. You leave things and then you forget about it, and it just sits there to rot, right? So doing that inventory and applying and learning by SBOMs and applying SBOMs in your pipeline forces you to do that inventory check. And I think that's a really, really important. Once you've done that, you can then focus on the lifecycle and release management and making sure SBOMs fit into your lifecycle management. And once you've done that, then you can start focusing on the quality of SBOMs. And that's the next step with like MTIA and or CISA now, minimum elements, and making sure that all that data is represented in the SBOMs. But it might be a bit too front heavy to try to do that off the get-go. I would rather start with something so you build the processes and then you iterate and tweak and refine the process rather than try to solve it all in one big bang.
Is there a SBOM linter that ensures that you are okay?
So there are a few tools out there. We have tools in SBOMify that can do checks on this and see if they are compliant with various regulations. So there are, like I mentioned, CISA and NTIA minimum element. We have checks for that. There is FDA got some things as well. They have checks for. CRA got their own interpretation of this. So like if you remember in my presentation, I had like a Venn diagram between CRA and NTIA. That's kind of what you want. You want to incorporate both of those. And there are various tools. There's another tool out there called SBOMQS that can do SBOM analysis. But I would say NTIA minimum element is probably the closest thing to universal standard we have that is starting to become more and more referenced in what good looks like in terms of quality. And then there's this draft of the CISA minimum element that was published in the fall that probably going to be published later this year that kind of takes that and makes some changes to it. But it makes assessment of like, who are you as a company? Are there hashes represented in the SBOM and so forth? And there are quite a few things in there to make sure that your quality is tighter than just, and for clarity, none of those generic tools will produce an SBOM that is even close to complete with NTIA minimum element.
Thank you for all the insights. Is there anything else that you think it's useful for us to know?
The time to get on top of SBOMs is now. I expect all future compliance frameworks to require SBOMs. It becomes a litmus test of, do you know what's going into your software? We've already seen PCI DSS 4.0 calling for software inventory. My guess is the updates to ISO and the update to SOC 2, they will all require SBOMs, right? And I think it kind of reshapes your trust center, because obviously we've been a lot of hype in the last few years about trust centers, but I think the SBOM kind of needs to be front and center along with your compliance documents, because that's equally important that you know what you're going into your software. And I would argue it's actually even more important than making sure that you have like 2FA on your various services, right? So I think, and what I predict the future to happen is that we're going to see SBOM being a first-class citizen in your trust centers. And it's going to be part of almost all upcoming regulations and certificates going forward.
And last question before closing. We spoke before hitting the record button about what happened with Trivy these days. Care to comment?
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for the people over at Aqua. I mean, they've done a lot of good job for the SBOM community, but I guess we're still seeing how it's playing out. But for those who are not familiar, Trivy was one of the most popular generic SBOM generation tools out there that been around for quite some time. They have been compromised in 2 releases now, where they essentially had info stealers baked into the Trivy package. And that in turn has had blast radius when there have been other packages that has been compromised because of that, including a pipeline package called LightLLM, which was compromised a few days ago. We don't really know the extent yet, but there's evidence that suggests that the entire Aqua GitHub org has been compromised. So they basically managed to compromise Trivy and then work their way to the entire Aqua GitHub org. So we don't really know how bad this is, but it looks pretty bad. We've removed Trivy from our pipeline. So we used to use Trivy in SBOM Action as one of the SBOM generation tools. We never used affected versions, but we've still proactively removed Trivy from the generation tool, just rather safe than sorry, to be honest. I anticipate to see a greater fallout of this. LightLM is probably one of the first ones that we know of, but I doubt it's going to be the last one. And the reason why Trivy is such a juicy target for an info stealer is because it runs in your CI pipeline. And people tend to use long-lived credentials in their pipeline. And that's how they manage to kind of work their way. So the moral of the story here is move towards OIDC and like more short-lived credentials in your pipeline. Make sure that you pin all your GitHub Action modules to hashes rather than versions. Because the moral that we learned from the Trivy incident is that they overwrote releases, right? So we kind of think of Git tags and Git releases as kind of like firm, but they're not. You can overwrite them, right? So, but if you pin it to a hash instead, you can make sure that you know what you're doing with. Again, this is not like rocket science. This is not news. Everybody working in the security world are fully aware of that you should be doing this. But this is kind of a cautionary tale. What happens if you don't?
Okay. Thank you for sharing and thank you for your time.
Thank you.